Backstage, after one of the last nights when the room still pretended nothing had changed, Frank Sinatra is not smiling, not performing, not managing the mood. For the first time in years, his voice carries no rhythm meant for applause. Just exhaustion. Just truth sharpened by disappointment. He says it quietly, almost offhand. Too late to take it back. Too early to soften it. Rat Pack was a mistake. The words don't explode. They settle. No laughter follows. No nervous jokes rush in to save the moment. The air tightens. Every man in the room understands that something irreversible has just been spoken aloud. All eyes turn to Dean Martin. The public thinks they know him. The relaxed grin, the careless drink, the man who never seemed to take anything seriously. But the people in this room know better. They know he is the one who watches, who calculates, who understands endings long before they arrive. Dean doesn't respond. He doesn't argue. He doesn't defend the years, the nights, the brotherhood that made them legends. He doesn't try to rescue Frank from his own words. He stays silent. And in that silence, the power shifts. Because if anyone had the right to fight that sentence, it was Dean. And the fact that he doesn't changes the meaning of everything that came before. So the real question isn't what Frank meant. The real question is this. Why does the man who built half the magic of Rat Pack allow that sentence to remain unanswered, hanging in the room, untouched? The answer doesn't come quickly. But when it does, it rewrites the legend forever. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. They didn't call it an empire, but it felt like one. By the end of 1959, the nights in Las Vegas no longer had edges. They blurred into each other, Sands showroom lights melting into cigarette haze, applause rolling forward before the jokes had finished landing. The money was obscene. The favors were quiet and fast. Senators slipped in through side doors. Studio men waited like ushers outside dressing rooms that smelled of cologne and fatigue. From the outside, it looked like freedom had finally learned how to dress well. Inside, it felt different. Frank Sinatra had built this thing on instinct, on defiance, on the refusal to be managed. But now the room moved before he did. Laughs arrived on cue. Headlines wrote themselves. The pack no longer needed to be sharp. The idea of them was enough. That was the first crack. Not scandal. Not drink. Predictability. Producers began to hesitate, softly at first. A call returned late. A meeting shortened. The excuse was always polite. Too much Rat Pack. Too noisy. Too political. Too hard to separate the man from the circus. Sinatra had survived worse, but this was new. Being told the problem wasn't him, but the gravity he carried with him into every room. For the first time in years, the group that amplified his power also diluted it. Dean Martin noticed before anyone said it out loud. He stood apart on stage, always half a step removed, glass raised like a prop rather than a need. The audience thought the looseness was natural, that the ease came from not caring. They didn't see the calculation in it, the way he watched Frank scan a room, checking whether the applause still belonged to him alone. Dean understood systems. He'd lived inside one before, when comedy became confinement. He recognized the feeling when success stopped asking permission. He didn't challenge it. He didn't leave. That would have broken the spell too fast. If Dean walked, the pack would collapse into accusation and fear. So he stayed, quieter than before, absorbing attention without claiming it. He made himself smaller on purpose, a kind of ballast. The irony was cruel. The more he receded, the more the crowd leaned toward him. Outside the showroom, pressure gathered. Washington whispered. The Kennedy orbit tightened, and with it came men who didn't laugh. Files were opened, names were mentioned without context. What had once felt like access now carried consequence. The pack had become a liability, too visible to ignore, too informal to control. No one said it yet, but the equation had shifted. What once protected them now exposed them. On stage that winter, the jokes still landed. The smiles were practiced and perfect. But between songs, in the fractions of silence the audience couldn't hear, there was strain. Sinatra pushed harder, louder, asserting command over something that no longer responded to force. Dean watched, said nothing, and finished his drink without tasting it. The public saw kings at play. Behind the curtain, men were beginning to understand that they had mistaken momentum for permanence, and that the very success that built the legend had quietly set its limit. By 1961, the applause had developed habits. It rose at the same moments every night, a trained animal responding to familiar gestures. The pack walked on stage, and the room surrendered before a word was spoken. This should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like maintenance, something that had to be fed constantly, or it would turn. Frank felt it most when the laughter arrived late. Not absent, just delayed enough to notice. He compensated instinctively, tightening his grip on the rhythm of the show. He talked more, interrupted more, directed the energy like a man herding horses that no longer recognized his voice. Leadership had become supervision, and supervision required pressure. The audience, meanwhile, had found a different center. Dean didn't chase the room. He drifted through it. His timing was careless in appearance only. He let jokes fall flat on purpose, then rescued them with a glance, a shrug, a line thrown away like it didn't matter. That indifference became magnetic. Women leaned forward. Men relaxed. He didn't need to dominate the moment. He let it come to him. Backstage, this was noticed. Not argued over. Not confronted. Just observed in the way men observe weather they don't control. Frank never accused Dean of stealing attention. He didn't have to. Control isn't lost in dramatic moments. It erodes quietly, when the room begins to respond to someone who isn't asking for it. Dean understood the danger before it became personal. So he adjusted. He leaned harder into the image everyone already believed. The lazy drunk. The man who didn't care enough to compete. He slurred lines he knew perfectly well. Missed cues by half a beat. Let Frank correct him in public. Each small surrender diffused tension that could have turned sharp. It was not humility. It was strategy, making himself non-threatening to preserve the structure that fed them all. The sacrifice went unnoticed, as sacrifices often do. Then came the night it slipped. Mid-show, riding the energy, Frank improvised. A line tossed toward Dean, framed as humor, sharpened just enough to draw blood. The room exploded. People loved it. Rivalry, even imagined, sells. Dean smiled on cue, lifted his glass, played along. On stage, it passed. Off stage, it didn't. When the curtain fell, Dean didn't linger. No jokes, no slow goodbyes. He took his jacket and left through the side corridor, the one that avoided conversation. It wasn't anger that drove him out, it was clarity. Something had crossed from performance into truth, and pretending otherwise would have required effort he no longer wanted to give. Frank noticed the absence too late. No confrontation followed. None was needed. The message wasn't delivered in words, but in withdrawal. Dean's silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate containment. By leaving quietly, he prevented escalation. By not responding, he denied the moment its afterlife. The pack kept moving. The shows continued. The money arrived on schedule. But something had shifted beneath the surface, an understanding that the stage no longer belonged to one man. and that the cost of pretending otherwise was beginning to show. By the middle of the decade, the work had changed its name. It was still called Rat Pack on marquees, still sold as rebellion dressed in tuxedos, but inside it felt like obligation. Dates were booked further in advance. Jokes were recycled without apology. The edge that once came from danger now came from endurance. Revolution had hardened into routine. Dean began to step away without ever announcing it. He declined projects with the careful language of courtesy. Scheduling, family, timing. Never refusal, always postponement. He let others take the spotlight on joint appearances, arrived late, left early. From the outside, it looked like indifference. From the inside, it was a controlled reduction, the slow loosening of knots that would otherwise tear. Frank noticed, but differently than before. He was tired in a way success doesn't cure. The pack no longer shielded him from pressure. It multiplied it. Every choice carried weight, political, cultural, personal. What had once felt like camaraderie now demanded constant management. The joke had become a responsibility. The laughter, a deadline. Dean watched all of it with the patience of someone who sees the ending before the room does. He had always separated stage life from real life with unusual discipline. Home was not an extension of the act. Children were not props. He guarded that line fiercely, because he understood something the others didn't. When performance invades everything, loss has nowhere to land safely. The fear wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It lived in small hesitations, pauses before phone calls, a reluctance to celebrate too loudly. Dean carried an awareness that joy borrowed recklessly would one day demand repayment. He didn't know how or when. He only knew enough to be careful. Frank, for the first time, began to question the machine itself. In private moments, late nights without an audience, he admitted what he never would publicly. The pack had grown bigger than the men inside it. It decided schedules. It shaped perception. It made solitude suspicious. He could feel his name slipping into plural form. His identity fused to something he no longer controlled. The realization wasn't anger. It was grief. The phrase hadn't been spoken yet, but it was forming, slowly, painfully. The understanding that what saved him once was now costing him something he couldn't name. Dean sensed that too. He didn't confront it. He prepared for it. He reduced dependence, built quieter routines, chose work that allowed distance. Not escape. Distance. There is a difference. One runs from collapse. The other steps aside so collapse doesn't take everyone with it. By 1966, the audience still roared, unaware they were applauding a structure already cracking from within. No final argument had occurred. No dramatic exit. Just the weight of time pressing down on friendships stretched too thin by success. Something was coming apart. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the space between men who once didn't need words to understand each other. And the most painful truth of all was this: the end was approaching not because they failed, but because they had succeeded too completely. The room was smaller than the stories would later make it. No cameras, no smoke, just a low ceiling, a table scarred by years of careless glasses, and men who had already spent their best energy elsewhere that night. The show was over. Applause had been folded away like a costume. What remained was fatigue, the kind that strips away performance whether you want it to or not. Frank spoke first, not because he planned to, but because silence had begun to feel heavier than honesty. He didn't raise his voice. There was no dramatic pause. The words came out the way truths sometimes do when they've been waiting too long, almost casually, as if saying them plainly might make them easier to live with. He said they had built something unstoppable. He said it had given them leverage, power, access. And then, without looking at anyone in particular, he admitted that the same thing had taken something back: control, definition, the ability to walk into a room as one man instead of an emblem. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a confession either. More like a tired inventory. Someone shifted in their chair. Another laughed softly, unsure whether humor was expected. The air held, waiting for the moment to either fracture or move on. All eyes drifted to Dean. This was the part everyone anticipated: the smoothing over, the joke, the gentle redirection that would let them leave without confronting what had just been placed on the table. Dean had always been the release valve, the one who knew how to keep the night intact. He didn't do it. He didn't argue the point. Didn't remind Frank of what the pack had given him, or what it had meant to all of them. He didn't rescue the moment with charm. He simply listened, hands still, expression unreadable. The silence stretched, uncomfortable precisely because it wasn't hostile. It was neutral, final. That quiet unsettled the room more than anger ever could. Frank noticed. He mistook it, briefly, for agreement, or worse, indifference. He kept talking, clarifying, as if explanation might restore balance. He said they had turned themselves into a legend they couldn't slow down, that the thing they created no longer responded to individual will. Dean remained still. Later that night, away from the others, he spoke to someone he trusted. Not defensively, not emotionally. He said Frank was right, but not for the reasons he thought. That the problem wasn't the pack itself, but the belief that it could keep going without changing what it cost the people inside it. He didn't say this to Frank. He didn't need to. By then, Dean had already stepped away internally. The leaving had happened long before anyone noticed the distance. What remained was courtesy, habit, and respect, none of which could stop an ending once it had begun. The phrase would eventually be repeated, polished by memory and retold as drama. But that night, it landed softly, almost accidentally. And in that softness was the real damage. The recognition that some truths arrive too late to fix anything, but just in time to be understood. Time answered questions that arguments never could. By the end of the 1960s, the separation no longer needed explanation. It simply existed. The pack wasn't officially dismantled. It had dissolved the way certain friendships do, without betrayal, without ceremony, through mutual exhaustion. Public memory lagged behind reality, clinging to the image long after the structure was gone. Frank struggled against that lag. He fought to reclaim authorship of his own name, but the shadow followed him. Interviews circled back to the same subject. Promoters leaned on nostalgia. Every appearance carried the unspoken expectation that he would resurrect something already spent. He wasn't angry about it. Anger would have given him direction. What he felt instead was friction between who he had been and who the world insisted on remembering. Dean chose another route. He didn't announce a retreat. He didn't frame his next steps as independence or victory. He simply narrowed the frame. Television suited him, contained, predictable, free from the mythology that swallowed live performance. His solo shows were calm, almost detached. He arrived, did the work, left. No statements, no corrections of the record. From the outside, it looked like ease. From the inside, it was discipline. People mistook his distance for avoidance, but it was the opposite. Dean was protecting something fragile, the truth of what had existed. He understood that once you begin to argue over the past, you cheapen it. Debate turns memory into a contest, and contests require winners. He refused to assign one. That was why he hadn't challenged Frank's words. Disagreement would have implied that one of them was wrong. Dean didn't believe that. He believed the pack had been necessary and finite, that it had done exactly what it was meant to do, and no more. To deny its ending would have been dishonest. To fight over its meaning would have been worse. Privately, when pressed by people who wanted clarity, Dean offered something close to truth, but never quite explanatory. He said friendships don't survive being performed forever, that some bonds are built to exist in real rooms, not under lights, and that knowing when to stop is not surrender, it's respect. Frank, meanwhile, carried the weight differently. He spoke less about the pack, but when he did, his tone was careful, restrained. Not bitterness, regret. The kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness because it doesn't believe forgiveness applies. He understood too late that control once shared is rarely returned intact. Dean never capitalized on that realization. He didn't present himself as the man who saw it coming. He let history assume whatever it needed. Silence became his last contribution, not as absence, but as loyalty. He protected Frank from spectacle by refusing to participate in it. By the early 1970s, the story had settled into something quieter. The pack lived on in photographs, anecdotes, clipped laughter. What survived between the men was subtler. Acknowledgement without reconciliation. Respect without proximity. Dean had left the game without declaring victory. And in doing so, he answered the only question that mattered. Not with words, but with restraint. The world did not wait for legends to catch their breath. By the early 70s, the tempo had changed. Music moved faster, dressed younger, spoke louder. Stages grew larger while attention spans shortened. The culture no longer paused for familiarity. It demanded reinvention, and even that came with an expiration date. Frank and Dean were still recognized everywhere, but recognition is not the same as relevance. One warms, the other carries weight. Frank felt the shift like a challenge. He returned to old ground with new urgency. Anniversary concerts, carefully framed appearances, interviews that leaned gently into memory. The past had become a language audiences still understood, and he spoke it fluently. When asked about the pack, he answered politely, vaguely, as if naming it too clearly might reopen something that never properly closed. When Dean's name surfaced, his responses flattened, not cold, not warm, careful, measured. Regret disguised as professionalism. He wasn't angry. Anger implies blame. What Frank carried was recognition, that momentum once lost cannot be summoned back intact, that some eras answer only once. Dean moved differently. He avoided retrospectives, declined invitations designed to relive rather than create. He didn't monetize nostalgia or correct narratives that painted him as detached. Public absence became his signature. Not withdrawal, but refusal. He understood that repetition would turn memory into merchandise, and he would not sell what had once been shared freely. To many, it looked like indifference. It wasn't. Dean was guarding something internal, an unspoken agreement with the past that it would not be reshaped to suit the present. He allowed the pack to exist where it belonged, behind him, unchanged, untouched by explanation. Then life interrupted even that quiet arrangement. The loss arrived without spectacle, without preparation. A blow so personal it recalibrated everything that followed. Afterward, Dean's relationship with the world altered permanently. He spoke less, appeared rarely. The distance that had once been strategic became necessary. Grief stripped away performance with final authority. He did not return. Offers came. tributes, proposals framed as honor. He declined them all. Not out of bitterness, but because returning would have required pretending that the past still belonged to him in the same way. It didn't. It had become something else, fragile, sacred, sealed by loss. Frank watched this from afar. There was no confrontation, no reckoning, just an understanding that whatever might have been repaired was now irrelevant. Life had moved beyond repair. The differences between them were no longer about careers or control, but about survival, about how each man learned to carry what could not be fixed. By the mid-'80s, the contrast was unmistakable. Frank stayed visible, holding on to motion. Dean chose stillness, holding on to meaning. Neither was wrong. They were simply answering the same history with different instincts. The pack, once a living force, now existed only as memory. And memory, like grief, obeys no schedule. In the final years, the questions became quieter but sharper. They arrived without microphones, through intermediaries, producers, people who believed history needed closure to remain valuable. There were offers framed as opportunities, conversations proposed as corrections. A last interview, a definitive version, a chance to settle what others had spent decades speculating about. Dean listened, then declined. He didn't explain himself in full, only enough to end the discussion. He said that once a story demands a verdict, someone has already been misrepresented. That memory doesn't survive being cross-examined. What he left unsaid carried more weight. To speak now would require turning friendship into evidence, and he would not do that. Not at the end. By then, silence was not avoidance. It was coherence. Those closest to him understood that his refusal wasn't defensive. It was protective. Of Frank, of the past, of something that had never belonged to the public as much as people assumed. Dean had accepted long ago that endings don't need explanation to be legitimate. When the old phrase resurfaced, a mistake, it landed differently. Time had drained it of accusation. What remained was fatigue, the sound of a man realizing that momentum can outgrow intention. Frank hadn't been condemning the pack. He had been mourning himself inside it. Dean had known that the moment the words were first spoken. That was why he hadn't argued. You don't dispute grief. You recognize it. After Dean was gone, Frank spoke privately to someone who had known them both long enough not to repeat it for effect. He said Dean had understood something none of the others had. Not earlier success, not loyalty, but timing. Knowing when to stay still. Knowing when motion begins to cost more than it gives. It wasn't an apology. It was recognition. The world, of course, continued to simplify. Legends prefer clean lines. But the truth sat elsewhere, in the quiet decisions no one saw, in the refusal to reframe the past for comfort, in the choice to let something end without turning its ending into spectacle. The Rat Pack had not been a mistake. The mistake was believing it could remain alive without changing what it asked of the men inside it. Dean had seen that truth before it demanded proof. He didn't fight it. He stepped aside. And in doing so, he preserved what mattered. Not the image, not the noise, but the dignity of an ending allowed to be final. No moral followed. No resolution arrived on cue. Only a silence that lingered longer than applause ever did, and said more than any explanation could have.